An elephant never forgives. You have to feel bad for elephants. All they really want to do is chill out by the watering hole with their buds. But because they're so big and weird looking, humans have used them for everything from circus performances to weapons of war, and even for executions. The most infamous and well-known employment of elephant executioners comes from medieval India and was known as Gunga Rao. If you consider that an Asian elephant typically weighs around 8,800 pounds, as much as 9 grand pianos, it doesn't take long to figure out how they could be used to end a life. Gunga Rao involved the victim placing their head on a wooden stake, as an elephant was slowly marched towards them before squishing the life out of them with their enormous feet. Gunga Rao was not employed conservatively and was the punishment of choice for everything from thievery to tax evasion. This is perhaps why it captured the imaginations of medieval travelers to India, though elephantine executions actually dated back to the classical era. They were employed in ancient Rome, Carthage, and Macedon. And one instance after the death of Alexander the Great, Macedonian regent Perdiccas sentenced dozens of insurrectionists to a hefty trampling. And while the straightforward smooshing was devastatingly effective, there have been other, more creative forms of pachyderm punishments around the globe. In Thailand, elephants would fling victims around like ragdolls with their powerful trunks, whereas in Sri Lanka, they'd be gored with their menacing tusks. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta wrote of an incident of Gunga Rao in which the elephants were wearing sharp instruments on their feet and tusks to aid in the execution, which really seems like overkill to me. Literally. A load of steaming bull. If you've ever had to use public transportation on a hot day, you might have some idea what this next punishment is like. King Phalaris ruled over what is now Sicily between 554 and 570 BCE, and was known for his cruel and potentially even cannibalistic tendencies. The story goes that he was keen to create a new nauseating torture device. To make it, he commissioned the one guy in town more messed up than him, an inventor named Perilos, who created the Brazen Bull. The device was a bronze statue of a bull with a hollow and large interior. The victim was to be placed inside the dark, cramped statue before a fire was lit underneath it. As the statue slowly heated up, the victim would be cooked alive inside. Now, if that wasn't enough to tip you off that Perilos was a serious sadist, consider the fact that the bull's nostrils were connected to the statue's interior. This meant as the victim struggled, their screams would reverberate out of the statue, mimicking the cries of a raging bull. Even Phalaris, the infamously cruel tyrant king, took one look at the brazen bull and said, this is a little messed up, dude. As punishment for, basically doing what he was asked, Phalaris had Perilos entombed inside his own creation and a fire was lit underneath. After getting a few good chuckles in, Phalaris let Perilos out, apparently assuring him it was all just a harmless joke. Changing his mind yet again, Phalaris then had Perilos tossed off a cliff. Talk about indecisive. Oh, and according to some accounts, Phalaris was later burned alive in the very brazen bull he commissioned during an uprising. So let this be a lesson to everyone watching. If you invent a gruesome method of execution, don't be surprised when it's turned against you. I'm fuming. Things are about to get steamy, because it's time to talk about being boiled alive. That's right, ever since people figured out they could boil a carrot to make it softer, awful tyrants have been doing the same to people. The earliest records of lethal boiling came from Emperor Nero in ancient Rome, with the victims primarily being Christians. In 1531, King Henry VIII of England passed an act decreeing poisoning a crime punishable by boiling. This was probably because Henry had an apparent fear of poisoning. And look at the dude, he wasn't about to stop eating. Shortly after Henry died, Edward VI outlawed boiling, recognizing the Middle Ages were coming to an end and it was time to rein in the nasty stuff. But how nasty was it? Well, you could call it a death that retreats inwards, starting in your extremities. This is because your arms and legs are the most exposed parts of your body and contain lots of nerve endings, so pain begins in your fingers and toes and shoots inwards. After this, your skin, muscle, and fat begin to soften and liquefy from the heat, fusing to your clothes. This heat will then boil your organs from the inside as well as your flesh from the outside. You'll also likely go blind fairly quickly, so you'll be thrashing around in the dark. If you're dunked into water that's already bubbling, your brain can boil inside your head fast, which is strangely merciful. If you're placed into a liquid that's slowly heated up, your body will try to adjust to the temperature change, which really drags things out, making everything slower and more agonizing. If your executioners know what they're doing, this can take minutes or even hours, and you'll be awake for most of it. Maybe now you'll feel a little more sympathy for those lobsters in the grocery store tanks. Thankfully, this punishment isn't employed anywhere in the world today, though people still accidentally boil to death today in hot springs and sewer accidents, just in case you thought it was a fate of the past. Ride it out. Here's a fact to soothe your nerves. As it turns out, many of the scariest looking torture devices from the Middle Ages are fake. Shady museums and con men began creating nasty contraptions in the 18th century, which quickly captured the public's imagination. This means famously nightmarish devices like the Iron Maiden and the Pair of Anguish are just props rather than actual torture implements. Nerve soothed? Good, because this next one is awful and real. Introducing the wooden horse, also known as the Dutch horse or Spanish donkey. If the multinational names didn't tip you off, the wooden horse was a punishment device popular across medieval Europe. The contraption consists of a long, square-shaped wooden beam held up by several legs for support. One of the corners of the beam would be positioned skywards, and the unlucky victim would be forced to straddle the beam. The corners would uncomfortably dig into the victim's crotch as well as the sides of their legs. On some occasions, weights were applied to the victim to drag them down more. The corners of the wooden beam could be quite sharp, but it didn't matter too much if they weren't, because victims would have to ride the horse for hours or even days at a time. Though the wooden horse wasn't lethal, it was extremely painful and restricted blood flow through the legs, which could cripple the victim. To add insult to injury, the wooden horse would sometimes have a mock head and tail at either end and be long enough to support multiple people. The Judas cradle was a more personal version of the device and featured a single large spike positioned on the seat of a chair. Talk about a pain in the head. Grotesque and uncivilized as it was, the wooden horse was still in use during the American War of Independence. George Washington himself claimed it was an excellent way to extract information from prisoners. Well, I guess it's one way to get someone off their high horse. Pain in the head. Our next story concerns the practice of iconoclasm. And no, that isn't a metal band made up of your desktop icons. Iconoclasm is the destruction of religious idols, texts, and monuments, and around the year 720, it swept across the Byzantine Empire. The belief was that the biblical second commandment expressly forbids the worship of images and idols. This ideology continues in some ways today in Judaism and Islam, the two other Abrahamic faiths. At the time, however, not every God-fearing Christian was on board with iconoclasm. Two such anti-iconoclasts were brothers Theophanes and Theodore, and they weren't afraid to preach. They were so bold, they even sought an audience with Emperor Leo V, sometime in the 810s, asking him to kindly butt out of ecclesiastical matters. He took that surprisingly well for an evangelical emperor, sentencing the brothers into exile on a small island. When Leo was assassinated in 820 and the brothers regained their freedom, it wasn't long before they ended up in front of the new emperor Theophilus, who was decidedly less forgiving than old Leo. Theophilus subjected the brothers to 2 days of torture, in which a 12-line poem insulting them was carved into their heads with hot needles. A rough translation of the poem is on screen now. But man, at school I was bullied for having a 5-head. How big must have theirs been to fit all this? Neither brother accepted iconoclasm, with Theodore eventually dying in prison. Theophanes, however, was only exiled and became a bishop when icon veneration was eventually restored. For their efforts, both brothers were canonized as saints, Theophanes and Theodore the Branded. Funny that their images are now celebrated in religious art all these centuries later. How would they feel about it? Well, I think the answer would be written all over their faces. Total blackout. If you're like me, there's a good chance you've tried to get in shape only to head back to the sofa after a single squat. This exercise already sucks. Could you imagine doing it for hours in complete darkness? That's the idea behind the blackout box. This punishment and interrogation method was utilized by the CIA during the War on Terror. While former CIA executive Buzzy Krongard and even President Obama have admitted that the USA commits torture, some still prefer the term enhanced interrogation. The blackout box is a small box, just barely big enough to fit a crouching human being inside. Remember how awful and dehumanizing solitary confinement sounded? Well, the blackout box is the most extreme version imaginable, locking a person into the darkest, tightest space possible. To cause stress, the high-pitched sounds of crying children are sometimes played inside the box. In 2015, a journalist from the BBC underwent a blackout box demonstration when after less than 15 minutes demanded to be let out. Less fortunate folks have been forced inside boxes less than 1.75 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, and 2.5 feet tall, which is smaller than some dog crates, and is hauntingly depicted by their drawings. Some have spent up to 250 hours in this box, and that's over 10 days. In one particularly vile instance, the captors discovered the victim had a fear of insects, and so they poured live cockroaches into the blackout box while the victim was inside, leaving them to crawl over their body for hours. Never thought I'd say this, but suddenly being boiled alive doesn't sound all that bad.